The title of my paper today is The Study of Shi'i-Islamic Prayer in Conversation with the Psalms. I wanted to begin today. Well, actually, just before I begin, I would preface my remarks by saying that some of the work that I've put into this paper is a work in progress. It's not included in the book. So much so because it's an area that I'm working on, which is this, looking at Islamic liturgical literature as a site of both comparative theology and comparative method, and both, looking at it from both angles. So some of my paper is both developing, and I would also, of course, would like your input and insights and suggestions. The celebrated religionist and McGill scholar, the late Wilfred Cantwell Smith, reports in a national radio talk in 1962. He said, "I remember in India some years ago when my wife and I were one summer at a mountain resort in the Himalayas, and we were out for a hike in the hills. We came upon a work gang busy in the construction of a rude mountain road. It was, of course, all hand labor. They had crushed the stones with hammers and now were rolling them with a large and very heavy roller. Rather in the fashion, sailors working to a sea shanty, they were there rhythmically pulling this heavy roller in spurts of concerted effort. The foreman would sing out, 'La ilaha illallah,' there is no God but God. And the rest of the gang would put their shoulders to the ropes and with a heave would respond, 'Muhammad Rasulullah.' So they're crying out, 'There is no God but God.' And then the other workers would heave and respond by saying, 'And Muhammad is the messenger of God.' This went on, and as they continued to work with a will and with good strong heaves, 'La ilaha illallah,' he would chant, 'Muhammad Rasulullah' would come as a vigorous response. Such a scene represents a kind of living in which a split into religious and secular has not yet come. These prayers, chants, and incantations represent the break of the divine into the mundane, which represents the very longing and aspirations of the inner life of both religious individuals and communities. When such prayers are uttered or believed to have originated from the ecstatic moments of saints, they in turn become sacred literature, or a form of sacred literature. Such utterances, when repeated as liturgical script by the devout, tethers them to that sacred past, initiating the supplicant into a meta-historical communion with the saint who becomes the indispensable portal to the otherwise unknowable God, who then becomes immanent in that moment of desperate cry. So the otherwise transcendent becomes immanent in that moment of that desperate cry. Clearly, this is not something unique to Islam or Shi'ism. Rather, such prayers reflect a concern with individual eschatology, which formed a unique aspect of communitarian religions of the book, which marked a decisive transformation in late antique religiosity. As they formed and transformed through late antiquity, these religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and finally Islam, had two unique overarching concerns. Firstly, there was a new attention given to an eternal self, which requires reform and spiritual development, all to draw closer to God. Secondly, this unseen self must prepare for final judgment, and thus must do all it can to attain eternal paradise and avoid eternal damnation. The teleological underpinnings of prayer for religions of the book enhance one's relationship with a God that is worthy of worship, and the one entity that can save the believers from their unruly selves, as well as provide the consolation of an eventual deliverance in this world and the next. The development of private prayer and its associated liturgy, detached from animal sacrifice, becomes a nexus for expressing this teleology. The textual analysis that I will be presenting towards the end will slightly be concerned with how this teleology is expressed through a particular instance of dua or supplication or calling upon God. Kenneth Leach has aptly stated in his study on Christian spirituality and prayer that Christian theology cannot survive in a healthy state apart from the life of prayer and the search for holiness. It's my assertion that a similar characterization can be made of Shi'i liturgy, or Muslim liturgy as a whole, insofar as worship and devotion provide the primary experience of God and the imams for the devout who do not spend their life immersed in the specialized study of Islamic texts. For Shi'i Muslims, their devotional acts can be generally split into two parts. This is what makes Shi'is unique. Those directed to God, that's petitions, prayers, laments, repentance, praise, directed to God. Then there's a whole set of liturgies, prayers, devotions directed to their infallible imams, who include the Prophet, his daughter Fatima, and the 12 imams. So prayer can be split into two parts. One part is known as dua, which is supplication, to call upon. That's generally reflected to God, calling upon God. But then there's another genre of literature known as ziyarah. So when one goes to visit a shrine of one of the infallible imams who they believe are appointed by God, and their very word reflects the will of God. So they're not ordinary saints in Shi'ism. This is something very important, I think, that needs to be understood. This is what differentiates Shi'is from other Muslims. In the Twelver branch of Shia Islam, there are 14 of these infallibles. They're believed to be infallible in the sense that they're believed to have been protected by God from committing sin. And in that sense, their every word, their every act, their every emotion, in some sense, reflects or is a sacred moment. So hence their utterances and their devotions, their prayers, their spiritual moments are revered by Shiite Muslims. They're not mere prayer texts, they're sacred prayer texts. So and there are 12 imams, and the last imam is the Mahdi, who's believed to still be alive, according to Shi'is. He's in occultation, where he went into occultation in the year 941 and is believed by the Imami 12 Shi'is to still be hiding or in occultation until he reappears as the divine savior. So why is this important? Because the texts that Imami 12er Shias, which is a sect of Shi'ism, which is the largest sect of the Shias, forms roughly about 20% of the Muslim community, maybe more depending on the numbers, believe they pray to God. Their devotional life, their spiritual calendar revolves around prayers and devotions that are compiled, that they believe are compiled and written by these sacred personalities. Who for them, they do not differentiate in terms of spiritual status between their imams and Jesus or Moses or Abraham. In fact, there is a belief that they may even be spiritually superior to all prophets except for Muhammad himself. So when we think of these prayers, these are not utterances of ordinary saints, really, or Sufis that went off on the path and went through a process and found God at some point, like Al-Shadili and Jilani and people like that, or Ibn Arabi. No, it's very different. It's not the same because it's literally a form of infallible sacred literature. Thus, for Shi'is, these acts of devotional prayer, whether they be petitions to God or salutations to their imams, could certainly be described as sacred lessons in devotional theology in which the infallibles of Shi'ism taught the seekers how to express their deepest feelings and to find words for the dialectic of the embattled self in the presence of God. In the broader sense, both dua and ziyarah, dua is supplication to God, ziyarah is this genre of literature exalting and praising the imams, are reflective of a conscientious attempt to acculturate Shi'is to Islamic ideals such as belief or creed or pietistic discipline. This is how Frederick Heiler has described the pivotal role played by Augustine's understanding of prayer, which may be analogous to how the infallibles or saints of Shi'ism propounded prayer to the seeker of spiritual enlightenment in their midst. For Heiler, it was Augustine who in prayer masterfully combined the passion of the Psalms' lament over the self with the Neoplatonic contemplative mysticism, which when brought together best express a deep dialectic of the self that contends with both of these realities while returning to the infinite one. This is Heiler's description in his masterful work, of course, on prayer, entitled Prayer, A Study in the History and Psychology of Religion. In this case, for Shi'is, the Imam would not be compared per se to Augustine, to that of Moses, David, Jesus, the case of Fatima, Mary. Hence, their words and especially their prayers would become a source of voluminous devotional prayer manuals, commentaries, and marginalia, much like the rich and storied history of Psalm interpretation. As both traditions are a product of antiquity and late antique monotheism, they have much in common in terms of their respective prayer traditions. These synchronicities or commonalities can be generally viewed in two ways, at least as I see it. As I said, this is, something I've been thinking about for a long time, but I haven't yet really written on it. It's just touched upon in the book. It's something I'd like to flesh out a lot more. Firstly, there's a possibility of comparing the texts themselves, especially, for example, Psalms of Lament and Praise come to mind, to something similar kind of prayers or supplications that are found in the Shi'i devotional texts. Secondly, and perhaps more easily, I am of the view that Islamic studies scholars who work on prayer, which are unfortunately very few, and by prayer here, I'm not speaking about the salat. Salat, which is the daily canonical prayers. There's been a lot. Marian Katz has written on that. Other people have written on that, the ritual of the daily prayers. Here I'm speaking about personal devotional supplications to God, known as dua, or ziyarah, which is the devotional eulogies that are directed towards the imams. Right? These are two different genres. One is praying to God. The other one is turning to the imams, describing their attributes, loving them, saying, I've come to visit you. I love you. You died as a martyr. I honor you now. So intercede for me before God. These are two genres of literature, which are two sides of the same coin in Shi'i Islam. And often the genre of ziyarah includes dua within it, because it begins with, very often, with the pilgrim who's coming to, let's say, visiting Imam Hussein in Karbala, or Imam Ali in Najaf, saying, oh God, I thank you for bringing me here. Oh God, forgive me for my sins. They don't turn to Ali and say, oh Ali, forgive me for my sins. They say, oh God, you brought me here. And then they switch from praying to God to saying, peace be upon you, oh Ali, you know, exalting his attributes. And then concluding again by saying, oh God, don't make this my last pilgrimage to Ali. Oh God, make Ali my gateway to enter into heaven. Right? So it's a very interesting braided combination here of devotion to God. There's a clear bifurcation, right? In Arabic, it's Allahumma, oh God. Right? It begins, the supplication generally begins in that way. Or Ya Ilahi, oh Lord, oh my Lord. With then, Assalamu alayka ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, for example. Peace be upon you, oh the commander of the faithful. So my point is that Islamic studies scholars who work on prayer can benefit from the typological frameworks developed for the study of the Psalms, particularly, and again, I'm not an expert in the Psalms. I did my minor comps, my PhD on prayer under one of the students of the Archbishop of Canterbury, so he really put me through the texts from Origen to Thomas Merton, but I'm not an expert in it. It was just something I had to do for a year during my doctorate, but it was very helpful to me. And along the way, I was given this text by a scholar at Wycliffe College in Toronto, by a professor. It's called Psalms, A Guide to Studying the Psalter by W.H. Bellinger Jr. So I really benefited from this book. And in this book, I found it to be a great starting point in which he outlines the historical contours of the Psalms and the accompanying interpretive tradition, ranging from literary poetic studies to historical studies which attempt to understand the historical setting of specific psalms, or even those studies that focus on superscriptions. So, for example, above the psalm or attached to the psalm is a superscription which tells you what that psalm is about. But those superscriptions were added later. Where did they come from? How were they added? That is a whole genre of academic inquiry. And that's also something that is in the Islamic tradition. There are superscriptions written about these prayers. There's a discussion. Did Imam Ali, if it's believed to be from Ali, put the superscription? Or was some later scribe, compiler, adding that superscription, the title of the prayer? It's a whole discussion. We haven't yet developed it in Islamic studies. This is a whole genre of literature that Bellinger points out is extensive. But in Islamic studies, we're still, I don't even know if we're at the beginning of the study yet. It's something that is still in its birth pangs, literally. So using works like this, I found were very helpful. For example, he says Hermann Gunkel classified psalms according to type, which could simply be a hymn of adoration or a community lament, among many others of which reflected the religious life of ancient Israel at its various stages. So this whole discussion in the Psalms, which Bellinger points out, as do others, that okay, the Psalms, the content is one thing, it's prayer, it's spiritual efficacy, but what does it tell us about the religious ritual life of ancient Israel at that time? It's a historical method, and that's a whole genre of psalm study in itself. It has a method, it has a typology, it has a history, it has a whole extensive bibliography attached to it. Again, in Islamic studies, we are just beginning the work with regards to, there is a few works out there, but my point is that there's a lot that I think can be learned from the study of the Psalms. The field of academic work on Islamic liturgy is currently in its infancy, as I mentioned, and in need of such conversation with its Jewish and Christian counterparts in the academy. If at all, reference to the plethora of secondary academic literature on the Psalms would assist scholars of Islamic devotional literature, and especially Shi'ism, in developing an academic vocabulary to describe such research when addressing prayers from a literary, historical, and theological perspective, all of which Bellinger lays out very well in his short monograph, introductory work here. Hence, there are two possible points of convergence between the study of Islamic prayers and the Psalter. One is in terms of content itself. The other is in terms of various textual and literary methods of interpretation that have developed over the centuries, the study of the Psalms in the field of devotional theology broadly. Now, where did Shi'i devotional literature come from? What is its history? What we know, based on manuscript studies and research, is the historical period of the Imams ranged from the 7th to the 9th century. That's when they lived, right? It's about a 300-year period, which is known as the historical period of the Imams, from the time of the Prophet, we would say, all the way to the 12th Imam and his occultation. So this is the period where the Imams of 12 Shi'ism lived. Central question that comes up is because we had no extant manuscripts from that historical period. All the prayers that we have attributed to them are retroactively attributed. So how can we know that they have uttered any of this? It could just be someone's imagination or someone wanting to retroactively ascribe something to them, because by ascribing something to them, it now becomes holy, sacred, versus someone's individual prayer, it's not necessarily sacred. What I've pointed out, and now this is in the monograph, this is in the book, that it is reasonably possible to articulate that such devotional texts were compiled and written during the life of the Imams. Now, how do we know this? We know this because there is a genre of literature known as tarajim, rijal, and faharis in Arabic. I'll translate that. Basically, prosopographical texts and biobibliographical texts and textual indices. A genre of literature which basically talks about the libraries that people have, the books that were in it, and the authors that lived in the past. Quite incredible, because the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century has preserved this material. When we examine this material, it tells us that from the earliest period, perhaps we would say from the first 50, 70, 80 years of Islamic history, people were compiling prayer manuals. And these prayer manuals were attributed, or the contents of them were believed to be based on the narrations of these sacred personalities. Then the scholars from the 3rd century onwards drew upon this literature, that it's believed that some of this literature may have survived and then became the foundation for later prayer manuals as they were compiled in the, I was using Hijri centuries here. So we're talking about the 7th to the 9th century of the Common Era. So from the 9th, or I would say 10th century going forward, the texts that were compiled at that time, it is very well reasonably possible to delineate that they were able to draw upon a tradition that originated from the historical period of the Imams. And these are ostensibly thousands of utterances or prayers attributed to the Imams. So the tradition is very large. And it, like I said, can be reasonably asserted that it goes back early. Can it be asserted for certain that Hussein ibn Ali or Imam Ali, the first Imam, actually uttered these prayers? No one knows. We don't have archaeological evidence from that time. We don't have textual evidence from that period that has survived to that effect. But we have the record of books of their companions who've recorded their prayers in their presence. We have a record of the incidents taking place, but not the actual books remaining. So, the case of the Shi'i liturgical manual, which is basically a manual of prayers and devotions, which is divided by hour, day, week, and month. So every hour actually has a prayer. And every hour is attributed to an imam. Right? So the prayers are divided by hours, prayers of the day, prayers of the month. So it's basically you could think of it as a spiritual calendar by which the devout can organize their lives. So for example, you recite this prayer on this day because Imam Ali recited a prayer on this day, at this time, at this moment. On this Friday, for example, Fridays have special prayers, Thursdays, so on and so forth, and every hour of the day, right? So there's 12 hours. That way, I guess they calculated time back then. Now, once again, can some of this be put into conversation with Jewish and Christian devotion literature? Absolutely. Has that been done yet? To my knowledge, not extensively. But I think it's growing out of that same fertile, soil of, of this devotion to a monotheistic God, or to the idea of the one God. So it's certainly a fertile area of comparative theology and comparative study. And the case of the Shi'i liturgical manual, when viewed through the vicissitudes of time, reflects a discursive engagement with tradition, as well as what Jonathan Z. Smith describes as the persistence of the sacred. Really like that term that he developed, in which lists and categories, along with the community's exercise of exegetical ingenuity, produce and reproduce. In the Shi'i instance, this would apply to a set of liturgical rites set out according to the religious calendar preserved in manuals which enshrine prescribed liturgical acts as a matter of spiritual praxis. This process of transmitting, devising, and reconstructing such manuals is a process that can be described as an attempt to produce a liturgical canon that articulates a conception of both orthodoxy, that is, what one should believe about God and the imams, right? The correct way of addressing them and thinking about them and describing them. And orthopraxy, which is how one may bind their soul to them, the how part. That binds truth to distinct systems of power in which the scholars of Shi'ism, would inherit the traditions of the imams, right? So they see themselves as inheriting these prayers, inheriting these devotions, inheriting these litanies and these laments and so on and so forth from their sacred figures. And the scholars then itemize these prescribed liturgies so to delineate what the ideal Shi'i devotional life ought to be. And these texts, and the earliest of these texts, and perhaps the most famous, important of these texts, is known as a Sahifa as-Sajjadiyya. It's translated in Arabic as the Scroll of Sajjad, or Sahifa al-Kamila, the complete scroll, which is a book of 40 to 54 prayers, depending what edition you have, attributed to Imam Hussein's son, Ali ibn al-Hussein, who was at Karbala with his father. He was a teenager at the time, witnessed his father, his uncles, his cousins, so on and so forth, massacred at Karbala. And he then went on to compile a book of prayers. Anybody wonder what the title of this book is? The title that has been given later, retroactively to this book. The Psalms of the Family of Muhammad. Zabur al Muhammad. Why would the scholars, and I'm not sure how early this is, we see this in some biographical indices. There's no evidence that Ali ibn Hussein, the fourth Imam, the son of Imam Hussein, gave this as a title to his book. But clearly, Shi'i scholars imagined some kind of concordance between this prayer manual, and they titled it Zabur. Zabur meaning the Psalms, Zabur Dawood, the Zabur of David, right? And when we look at its contents, it's quite amazing. Right? It's a set of depending on what edition, in the current edition, 54 prayers of Ali ibn Hussein. There's a prayer for repentance, there's a prayer for children, there's a prayer for parents, there's a prayer for seeking needs, there's a prayer in fear, there's a prayer when one is sick. And each one, if you look at it, I mean, objectively, just looking at the Arabic, leaving aside the religious side, are literary masterpieces. They're extremely difficult Arabic. I remember in grad school, one of my PhD modules at that time was a study of the Sahifa with Professor Lawson, one of the obviously well-known Arabists and scholars of Islamic studies of our time, now Professor Emeritus. He was my supervisor and both teacher, and I remember we took a course on Islamic prayer, and he pulled out the Sahifa and he says, look, this is the gold standard, and we're going to read it. But we're going to read the Arabic, and we're not going to read the English, and you're not allowed to bring this translation to class. Wow, preparing for those PhD seminars was tough. He would go through, we went through the first 4 prayers. It took a few weeks. And we would read it line by line, looking at its poetry, looking at the references to the Quran, comparing it to pre-Islamic poetry, because it's compiled, it's written very much in the structure of pre-Islamic Arabia, which also gives us an idea of how ancient it is, how old it is. And this text is for Shias basically the second most important text after the Quran itself, after the Quran. It is the gold standard for devotion, and thus it's called the Psalms, the family of the Prophet. I don't want to go through its entire history, but there was a quote, and perhaps this is why there could be this synchronicity here. I want to cite the famous reformer Martin Luther, who describes the Psalms in the following way. He says, this is from A. Weiser's The Psalms, a Commentary. I found this quote in Bellinger here. He says, this is Martin Luther. Again, I'm not an expert in Luther, so if this is not actually attributed to him, please, I refer to secondary literature. I'm not a specialist. I don't claim to be a specialist in Christian theology or intellectual history of Christianity, but I mean, taken it from some established scholars, so hopefully it is from him. He says, this explains, moreover, why the Psalter is the favorite book of all the saints, and why each one of them, whatever his circumstances may be, finds it in Psalms, in words which are appropriate to the circumstances in which he finds himself, and meets his needs as adequately as if they were composed exclusively for his sake. So it is at once situated within a historical context, but universally spiritually edifying at the same time. And that is the experience that Shias have had with the Sahifa Sajjadiyya, and interestingly enough, Muslims as a whole. And although the Sahifa Sajjadiyya is generally not practiced widely by the Sunni community today, its earliest manuscript is from the year 416 Hijra. What is that of the Common Era? It's 416 Hijra. That would be the 10th century. 1020 about. That's the earliest surviving manuscript. I've discussed it in the book, in the monograph. Guess what? It was copied by a Sunni and endowed to a Sunni religious academy, seminary, madrasa, in that year. How do we know it's a Sunni text? Because it praises the caliphs. Sunni Shias don't praise the first 3 caliphs, only praise Ali, Imam Ali. Which also tells us that this is not exclusively Shi'i, but the Shi'i understanding of who Zain al-Abidin means actually the ornament of worshippers, the ornament of the servants of God. It's one of his titles. Sajjad means the one that's always in a state of prostration, or constantly in a state of prostration. Of course, their understanding of who he was versus a Sunni understanding is different. But it shows us that historically this text, which came to be known as the Psalms of the family of the Prophet, was practiced by both Sunnis and Shias. But the Shia tradition obviously took it on in a different way. And there's a whole history of commentary and so on and so forth. And there's a scholar now at Harvard who's doing her PhD just on that. So I can't wait for her work to be finished. She's at the Divinity School, I believe, or at the Middle Eastern Studies. And I'm in touch with her. So this text was very early. It's very well transmitted. There's an entire commentary tradition on it. And interestingly enough, a very important point here is the legal scholars of Shi'ism, the muftis in Sunni parlance, the ayatollahs in Shia parlance, Normally, you would think of them that they split hairs on purity and impurity and how to pray and what would break a prayer, and that's all fine. That's a part of the oath of orthodoxy. Or talking about intellectual issues regarding the attributes of God and so on and so forth. People like Shahid al-Thani and Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi and Ibn Idris al-Hilli. Yet all these people I've just mentioned, who are the doctors of Shia Islam, the luminaries of Shia Islam, the equivalent of Ghazalis and Shafi'i and Ibn Arabi al-Maliki and so on and so forth. I mean, these are the very famous luminary figures of Sunni Islam. These figures are also commentators on the Sahifa. We have manuscripts today. In fact, the most authentic manuscripts are in their handwriting, still preserved. And I have microfilms where they would diligently go through every single prayer, every single word, to ensure that it is read correctly, and if there is an alternative reading for the word, to mention it in the margins. So much for jurisprudence being the exclusive subject of study historically in medieval Shiism. It's just not the case. The study of this text known as the Psalms, the family of the Prophet, played a central and vital role in the devotional and scholastic life of both scholars and the lay members of the community. And for that reason, I think there's like 1,500 manuscripts of the text just in one catalog that I've. I mean, it's incredible, like 1,500 manuscripts. I mean, to produce a critical edition of that, you can imagine. I mean, it's a dream, right? I mean, you have so many texts available. And as I said, the earliest one is from 416. Ali ibn Hussein obviously died like around what, 89, I don't remember where, but from the 1st century. So obviously there's a gap between that and the life of Ali ibn Hussein. But within the context of Islamic studies, to have a manuscript for around that time, around 1020, I said, right? I guess, and give or take, around that, it's pretty good. I mean, as far as the standards of Islamic studies, to have a book surviving from that time is pretty good. And just to attest to how important this book is for Shias, Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi, the famous Safavid, Ibn Idris al-Hilli, says, who died in 1201 in the city of Hilla in Iraq. He says, was a famous jurist. He's a very, very famous jurist. He says, the Sahifa, as it is transmitted from the chief of the worshippers, the 4th Imam Ali ibn Hussein Zain al-Abidin, is the most sublime of what is engaged by the devout, muta'abbidin. This is the case when it is the dessert of the fruit of which its origin is the chief of the messengers, the Prophet Muhammad, and the soul of the soul that is connected with the sacred presence of the Lord of the worlds. Ibn Idris al-Hilli, as far as I know, is pretty dry in his writings. I mean, he's a legal scholar. His works in jurisprudence and demonstrative jurisprudence is very important, but equally his work on the Sahifa is formative. We don't often think of legal jurists in this way, but when we go to the manuscripts and we go to the existing literature, it tells us a very different story about the intellectual history of Shia Islam. And I would say Islam broadly, but here I'm focusing on Shia Islam here. What time is it here? 5:43. I've been going for about, what, 35 minutes? Yeah, so I think I'll wrap up here. I just wanted to give 2 samples from 2 supplications, just so everyone can kind of get a taste of what we're talking about here. So one is the supplication of repentance. And as I recite these lines, I would like my interlocutors and friends to help me along and think of ways that we could put this into conversation with Christian texts, or with the Jewish and Christian texts, obviously, because the Psalter is, is revered by, I believe, by both traditions, right? So this is the first passage. It's called the supplication of repentance. So in this supplication from the Sahifa Sajadiyah, he says, after making a sincere attempt to dig deep and realize what it is that I've done, the one that's repenting now turns to God and says, فَأَقْبَلَ نَحْوَكَ مُؤَمِّلًا لَكَ مُسْتَحِيًّا مِنْكَ. The sinner turns to you, feeling ashamed in front of you, O God. Laka, to you, O God. It's kind of intimate language. The child comes, like a child coming to a father or a mother, shy, ashamed, right? Mustahiyyan, right? Embarrassed, right? And the commentators say, لِشِدَّةِ عِلْمِهِ بِمَوْقِعِهِ عَيْبِهِ, due to the seriousness of their shameful acts. وَوَجَّهَهُ رَغْبَتُهُ إِلَيْكَ ثِقَةً بِكَ, and he directs his desires towards you, having trust in you. فَأَمَّكَ بِتَمَعِهِ يَقِينًا, and he says, I have put my trust in you, with certainty I long for you. يَقِينًا, that with certainty I long for you. وَمَا قَصَدَكَ بِخَوْفِهِ إِخْلَاصًا, and I have directed in the most sincere fashion all of my fears to you. فَمَثَلَ بَيْنَ يَدَيْكَ مُتَضَرَّعًا, and he fashions himself, right? This is a prayer, right? So you can imagine the person has done something wrong, they're turning to God. And he presents himself in front of you in a state of lowliness and humility, mutadarri'an. It's a reference to the Quran, that when one prays, they should do so in a state of humility. وَغَمَّضَ بَصَرَهُ إِلَى الْأَرْضِ, and his eyes are fixed towards the ground. مُتَخَشِّعًا, in a state of trembling awe. Setting the stage that even before the person says, God, ask me for forgiveness, there's this entire stage. And the Arabic is very beautiful, the words that are being used here, right? And these, of course, have Quranic references. And it's very interesting that when we look at the other prayers of Ali ibn Hussein Zain al-Abidin, in another prayer that he has, which is often recited in the month of Ramadan, he says to God, Lam astahika fil khala, that, oh God, and this is another interesting question we can discuss. He's an infallible in Shi'ism, and he's saying, oh God, I did not have any shyness or shame when I was in my private quarters. Ana sahib al-dawahi al-uzma, I'm the one with great cunning. Ana alladhi ala sayyidihi ijtara, I'm the one who is not only a person of great cunning, but I'm the one who dared to challenge my master. And I pushed my master, which is God, to the limit. I've transgressed like beyond bounds. أَنَا الَّذِي عَسَيْتُ جَبَّارُ السَّمَاءِ, I am the one who disobeyed the commander of the heavens. Very interesting. Think about this, that on one hand, theologically, he is infallible. But what would these words mean? Spiritually speaking, theologically speaking. Of course, that's a question for the insider to ask, but it's also interesting as an intellectual question itself. Yeah, just as a question to think about what this would mean paradoxically here. And if there's anything similar in how maybe this question is dealt with in other religious traditions, particularly in Jewish and Christian tradition with regards to, prayers of saints or prophets. And then he, in the supplication of repentance, he says, ugly is the transgression of your rule. وَقَبِيحِ مَا فَدَحَهُ فِي حُكْمِكَ مِنْ ذُنُوبٍ أَدْبَرَتْ لَذَاتُهَا فَذَهَبَتْ. There's a rhyme here. There's a sajah, course. I mean, in the Arabic, the endings are all, rhymed. Like there's a specific structure to it. And I know that's a whole study in the Psalms as well, which is a rhetoric and the structure of the Psalms. وَأَقَامَتْ تَبِعَتُهَا فَلَزِمَتْ. That my sins have turned their back on me and left while their ramifications and effects remain. That's an interesting one. Now, ending here, I wanted to cite a prayer from his father, Hussein in Karbala. So this prayer, second one I'm citing, and we'll go to discussion, is the prayer in which Hussein ibn Ali, it is believed, this prayer, this text is found in the earliest prayer manual, extant prayer manual of the Shias, which is Miswal al-Mutahajjid, which was compiled in about 1060 of the Common Era by Sheikh Tusi. And in this prayer, attributed to Hussein at Karbala, in his final moments just before he was executed, right? So you can imagine the scene here. He's thirsty, hungry, his children have been killed, because it's called his final prayer, his final cry to God. He recites the following prayer just before being brutally executed while thirsty and covered in wounds. So you can imagine the scene, right? He says, "O God, exalted is your place. I call upon you, ad'uka muhtajan, I call upon you in need. I seek you out as an impoverished beggar. Arghabu ilayka faqiran, wa afza'u ilayka khaifan. And I tremble before you in fear." This is Hussein ibn Ali's final words before his execution. Wa abki ilayka makruban, and I weep before you, stricken and broken. Makruban. Wasta'inu bika da'ifan, and I seek your aid in a state of weakness. Wa tawakkalu alayka kafiyan, and I rely on you entirely. So, O God, judge between us and judge between the people who have betrayed us and misled us. Right? Gharruna wa khada'una wa khadaluna. Judge between us and the people who misled us and abandoned us and committed treason against us, for they have fought us and set out to kill us, and we are the family of your prophet. So I would like to perhaps see how both of these prayers could be situated within some kind of conversation with the Psalms, either in terms of rhetoric or context or history or content. There was one that I thought of, which was Psalm 3, where it says, "Arise, O Lord, deliver me, O God." I read the commentary of this by Pope Benedict. It's called The School of Prayer. The Saints Show Us How to Pray. It's a beautiful, I found the commentary very interesting. This is where I got it from. Where the context of the above is that of David fleeing his son Absalom. And in that moment of plight and anxiety, David cries out to God, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of me, there is no help for him in God." Right? And Pope Benedict, or I think it's Cardinal Ratzinger, right? Says in his commentary that the greatest attack on David at this moment was not the physical one, but for him to lose faith in God. And in that moment, he cried out and was delivered by God. And Hussein here is crying out to God in this moment where his children have been killed. He's thirsty, he's laying there about to be killed, and he's crying out to be delivered. I don't know if it's something that could be put into conversation, but this is as much as I had to say. And I'm hoping maybe my colleagues or others may have something to contribute.
Great, thank you very much, Vinay. Thank you. Well, in a few minutes, we will go to questions and comments. Those of you online, you'll be very welcome to put your questions or comments directly to Vinay. But before that, we have some response from Dr. Danny Crowther, who is a research associate here at CMCS and a Psalms scholar, and is currently working on a book on the Psalms and the Quran. So you can see why he's here at the table.
Perfect. Yeah.
Danny.
Okay, I can see why I'm here. I'm not jealous of myself at this precise moment. So there's so many questions that come through. We haven't met or talked or shared, so all this slightly is new, but also exciting. I've got lots of questions that are going here in this. It's the Sahifa is the
the Sahifa,
of, and it's specifically of Hussein.
Ali ibn Hussein, his son.
Ali,
Yeah, his son, Imam Hussein's son. Yeah.
And is this the one that's been published as the Psalms of
The
Islam?
Psalms, yeah.
Yeah,
that's
so
right.
I suppose one of the questions that immediately comes to me, I'm running on here, so I think this is going to have to be slightly more interactive.
Yeah.
In the Psalms, we talk about reception history.
Yeah.
And we don't know when these Psalms were written or why they were written. We know that these superscriptions have been added in another era. And often they're almost contrary to the context. So, I mean, the classic line from Psalm 3 is Ani shakavti va'ishana, and I lied down and I slept.
Yeah.
So he's running from why
Yeah.
he's running from his son, and then the Psalm key line is, and I lied down and then I arose, refreshed. It's like, why did you choose that? Then that's a whole different thing. So you have the idea of, in this case, it seems that the superscription's been added to make something of this, makes the psalm function in a particular way. Some people say, I'm not going to follow that lead, and other people are going to follow the lead.
Yeah.
So I suppose in this immediately leads to one question, which is really how much of the imagined life is, if you like, added to the prayer, to fill it with meaning.
Yeah, yeah.
And then how much of it is you could take it off and then take it away. So I mean, a classic example of this with the psalm would be Psalm 51, which is the David is given us, wash me whiter than snow. And David saying, before you and you alone have I sinned, Lord. Now, the ascription is when he went into Bathsheba, which puts you into the context of he's committed adultery and he's arranged the murder of the person who is committed of the husband of Bathsheba. I know different traditions have different ways, but that's the subscription that's given up. Now, if you give that, then you're reading that psalm as well. He's committed adultery. He's murdered the man who he sinned against, and he cries, "Before you and you alone, Lord, have I sinned." How do you read that? Yeah. Now, if you read it without a subscription, and he hasn't committed this great sin, then you read it in a different way.
Context, yeah.
And David becomes, without that sin, he becomes somebody who's hardly done anything at all, and yet feels profoundly guilty before God. I'm sort of playing with these things I think could connect.
Definitely.
Saying, is this person, as you said, this sinless, perfect imam saying this? Is it leading us in a way that we, as however sin we've done, no sin at all, we should take on this attitude?
Yeah.
Or is this an attitude that, if you like, responds to the deep events of our lives?
Yeah, and this is a question that I do address in the book as well, to a certain extent, but not with regards to this prayer, but other ones, which is, there's a couple of things that we look at. One is a manuscript history. We try to look at the chains of transmission going back to the imams. Did the imam, is the title of the prayer something, or the title or the description of the prayer something that was given by the imam, or was it something that was added later? This is a principal question. Now, one of the ways within the Islamic tradition to kind of discover that is to look at the original report itself. So when we look at the original, whereas whatever we can identify as the earliest report, earliest instance in which this prayer is reported, is there a mention by the Imam himself that this is a prayer for children, or is it just somebody who read the prayer and said, "Oh, this looks like a prayer for kids. I'm going to add that as a title"? That's an afterthought, right? So that's one way, and that is a hotly debated subject. It's very, 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 very debated. Usually the way people add superscriptions is just by looking at the content. And then if they want to add something more as to its historical context, they would have to surmise somehow. Oh, he was saying this, so he must have been here because we know this about his life and this about his life, and we heard this about his life. So he's saying this, so we are surmising he was in this situation. It's conjecture, really. It's conjecture. No one, you cannot know for certain, really, unless it's in the original text or added later. So that's one way. And that's how we can perhaps differentiate between the degree of confidence that we can have in different superscriptions within the text themselves. And that's something that I broached the subject in the book, but there's so much more to be discussed in that regard.
Very, very briefly. I'm going to be brief to give other people lots of chances. But I've got two other thoughts. So the first one was just, what setting do you put the prayer in, and who does that? The second one, which I think might be also another interesting thing, would be this kind of speech act theory, which is, I'm thinking here of Sadiq Khan, who would be 10th century, reading the Psalms and saying, look, these sounds like, why, oh Lord, why have you abandoned me, Lord? Why aren't you here? Why are you standing far away?
Yeah.
And he says, well, that can't be a saying of a holy man, because God has abandoned him. But no, that's not what's happening. What's happening is he's inspired there so that you take on this attitude before God.
Yeah.
So you're not relying on. In other words, it's not that this is all. The psalm you're going is so that when you stand up and say this, you become a particular person.
Yes.
So you're taking
instructive.
the aspects of the prophet or the person praying, and it's not. You shouldn't be asking questions about the person praying. You should be asking questions about what that prayer does to you.
And that again is another debate within the Shia tradition, especially because theologically there's a belief that they're infallible. So there are generally two theories. One is they never did they didn't commit any sin. They are just teaching other people how to pray. They're praying to God, but really it's instructive to others. Mm-hmm. The other theory is that no, as they climb the spiritual ladder, even if they may be infallible, that concept of infallibility does not mean that there's some kind of superhuman. They still cry, they still have fear, they still have certain, emotional moments in their life. And they're crying or repenting over their very humanness, over the fact that they cannot separate from this body and travel to God. So they feel entrapped in this physical realm in which they exist. And that is a very common motif in Islamic mysticism, and Islamic, and it's in Sufism as well. I discuss both in the book. I incline more towards the latter. I think it's more reflective of the second and of at least of high mysticism as it developed in Islamic thought. Because we see Sufis saying very similar kind of things as well. Except these texts are believed to be way earlier. I mean, we're talking the 1st century of Islam. if it can be traced back. And I think that it based on the narrations and the chains of transmission, it could be reasonably, at least part of it, traced back to Ali ibn Hussein, perhaps. Because there are, there's just so many different narrations. Again, we don't know exactly which one and so on and so forth, but could be reasonably traced back to him. But that discussion is very lively within Shi'i commentaries on the Sahifa and on other prayers as well. Yes.
And your other thought? You said
My
you had two
last
more?
one.
Yeah.
So now it's the last one. Wow. And I think that's related, but I'm thinking out prophetic, and I'm also thinking about projection.
Yeah.
So this idea that why did the prophet go through it?
Yeah.
And this idea that that maybe he went through it for our sake, and then leading on to that, which is the classic Christian way of reading these Psalms, is that they're the mind of Christ who suffers on our behalf.
Wow. Okay.
And you have David, the prophet, suffering, you have the prophets after suffering, and then the ultimate in Christ suffering. So you're having an insight into the mind of suffering that the prophet needs to go through for our sake, in this case, in the Christian. So so you feel like there's a projection. It's not just David, 10th century BC,
but it's
feeling these
meta-historical.
things. It's actually he's feeling these things because it's going to fit the experience of exile, or the experience of Christ on the cross, or rejection, or whatever. There's actually for us. Is that?
Oh,
That's my third thought.
Within Shi'i tradition, that is a very, very hotly discussed subject. This whole concept of redemptive suffering. And even the whole notion of the suffering of earlier prophets was for the sake of Hussein. That all of it was leading up. For example, John the Baptist suffering, his martyrdom, so on and so forth. All of it was leading up to the ultimate sacrifice, which was Hussein's sacrifice at Karbala. There's narrations to that effect. In fact, there's whole theology that's developed around this concept. But did he die for other people's sins? It's more explained in the sense that his suffering and his prayer and his cries to God in that moment are to wake up Muslims so that they better themselves. And he becomes this vehicle of salvation because of this corrective measure that he took to save Islam from, or to rescue it in Shi'i thought from the hands of tyrants. So there is this liberation theology that's built into it. It's not just ontological. It becomes ontological because of the liberation theology. Because he becomes this figure of justice and social justice. And I'm not using that in the contemporary terms. I'm using that in just as words, not as a political ideology or concept. So the salvation aspect of it is a product of the rising up against injustice.
So you become animal.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Danny.
That was some great questions there. Wow.
Yeah.
Very engaging.
Let's see.